Hi, my name is Alyssa Grenfell, and I am an ex-Mormon content creator and author. And my channel is all about sharing my experiences when I was still a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, and sharing some of the less well-known or kind of secret sides of Mormonism. A mission is a great example of that because there are so many rules, and a lot of people refer to Mormon missions as almost a cult within a cult. And so many people have tons of questions about what it's like to serve a mission. Most people have also seen missionaries out on their bikes, walking around, dressed like they're going to church all the time, and just have a lot of questions about how a mission works, what they're out there doing, and what's the purpose. I served my mission around 2013, 2014, and I served for a year and a half as a full-time missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Today, this video is dedicated to sharing my personal experience as a missionary and also sharing some of the kind of more general questions people have about what the purpose of missions are, what rules missionaries have to follow. They're very strict. The doctrine that missionaries are focused on teaching, and really the culture of what it's like to serve a mission. Before we jump in, please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to learn more about general interest Mormon topics like what it's like to receive the temple endowment, what it was like for me to get married in the temple. Primarily, the videos I make are meant to educate, to make sure that if people are joining the church, they have easy access to all the information about what it means to be a Mormon, a member of the church, and to give support to those who are leaving the Mormon church, who often feel very alone and alienated, and it helps to have a voice saying, "You're not crazy. These things are kind of insane to have experienced," specifically like the mission, the religious underwear, the temple endowment, the hyper strict rules and culture. And so like, comment, subscribe to help this video get shown to as many people as possible and to as many people who are curious to learn more about what it is to be a Mormon missionary. Most adults you'll meet who are Mormon, especially men, have served missions. And so this includes Mitt Romney, Lindsey Sterling, Elizabeth Smart, Brandon Sanderson, David Archuleta, a lot of the well-known Mormons that you might know, are Mormon in the back of your head. They almost certainly served a mission, especially if they are men. Many people are very curious about missions, and even Disney made a movie called The Other Side of Heaven with Anne Hathaway about Mormon missionaries. And if you want to watch a movie produced by Mormons for Mormons, I recommend The Best 2 Years, which is about 4 missionaries serving in Holland. These are very positive, mostly positive depictions, especially The Best 2 Years, that really focus on the positive aspects, or almost maybe naively the positive aspects of being a missionary. But I think are 2 movies you can watch if you want to see a fiction portrayal of what it's like to be a Mormon missionary. And The Best 2 Years I did look up, and you can watch it on YouTube for free. Missionary work has been deeply ingrained in Mormonism since the beginning, and the first ever missionary was Samuel Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, who went to proselytize for Joseph Smith from 1831 to 1832. Apparently, he walked over 4,000 miles trying to sell the Book of Mormon and find converts. The word mission sometimes gets misconstrued, I think, because lots of churches, specifically Christian churches, have missions that they go on. Mormon missions, though, are meant almost exclusively to proselytize. That's why you see Mormon missionaries in the most affluent areas of the country. They're not looking for necessarily service projects, they're looking for converts. And so a Mormon mission is different than a typical mission. There's no trip to go build a school in a third world country or dig a well or anything of that nature. Most of the time, probably about 95 to 99% of a missionary's time is meant to be dedicated towards teaching and finding converts to the Mormon church. This is my missionary handbook. This is the same handbook all missionaries still use. It's called Preach My Gospel. It's basically the guidebook and the manual that missionaries follow as they learn about how to be a proper missionary according to the church. So I'm going to read the purpose of a missionary. Your purpose as a missionary is to invite others to come unto Christ by helping them receive the restored gospel, Joseph Smith, through faith in Jesus Christ and his atonement, repentance, baptism, receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost, and enduring to the end. So the primary goal of a mission, what's your purpose? It is to convert people. And in many ways, conversion is seen as a better gift than service, like building a school or digging a well, because the gospel is everlasting. And, you can teach a man to fish, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's seen as more compassionate to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, Mormonism, than it is even to do acts of service. Women serve a mission for 1.5 years and men serve for 2 years. It's never explicitly said, but kind of inferred is that a woman's responsibility or goal should be to get married as quickly as possible, whereas a man is meant to prove, his salt, I guess, in the church, and to go on a mission and convert as many people as possible and just make it a longer experience. And so there's that 6-month difference. When I'm talking about my experience, it will always be about 1.5 years because that's how long I served. But for men, it would be 2 years because men and women have different things they're supposed to be focusing on as they're aging up and becoming adults in the church and in their lives. There are also senior missionaries. So this is people who are typically at retirement age, who no longer need to have a full-time job, who go on missions. Sometimes they become mission presidents or they work in the mission home, which is like the kind of hub, the center of the mission. And so that's also a position, but today I'm mostly just talking about the younger missionaries. For a very long time, the rule was that men could go on missions, young men could go at 19, and girls could go at 21. In 2012, they changed the rule so that boys could go at 18 and girls could go at 19. One aspect I've always found frustrating about Mormon missions is that they truly send you right as you are out of the house. And so you are technically an adult with an adult's decision-making skills legally. You couldn't send a 17-year-old on a mission where they're disconnected from their family, but at 18, it's legal because they're now adults. And I think, too, the choice to change the age to 18 and 19 moves up this decision, and so it gives fewer opportunities for young people to go out into the world and fall away. And so instead of a young man waiting till 19, that gives him 1 year out of the house to lose his interest in Mormonism. He's going at 19, basically at high school graduation. He's preparing to go serve his mission as soon as possible. And so I think that the reason they made that shift is because it gives young people fewer opportunities to fall away and keeps them so that they're still making this decision often when they're living at home. So if you're going on a mission at 18 and even 19, for a lot of these people, they're going from high school, especially young men who have the bulk of the responsibility and pressure to serve a mission. And so this age means that you are still at 17 very much under the watchful eye of your parents. You're going to church every Sunday. You're very embroiled within your Mormon community that you were raised in since you were a child. And so it's much less likely you're going to decide against going. Whereas if they wait till 19, they've moved out of the house. They've had their first year of college. They have a job. Maybe they have a more steady girlfriend. And so I think that a major reason that they chose to change the age is purely because they didn't want that fall off effect of letting young Mormon kids leave their families, leave their home wards, go out into the world, experience that there is more to the world than Mormonism necessarily has been offering them, and then choose as a consequence to not serve a mission. Mormon missionaries always serve in pairs of 2. So for my entire mission, I was always with another woman of a similar age, completely 100% of the time. The rule is known as sight and sound. So you have to be, for the entire mission experience, within sight and sound of your assigned companion. And this is not someone you get to choose. Like I said, this is assigned. Typically, you won't know them at all prior to getting assigned to them. So essentially, you're asked to be with a stranger 24/7. And the only times you're permitted to leave their side is for showering or to use the restroom. And so and missionaries take this very seriously. So right now I'm in this room. If my companion, if I was still a missionary, was stepping into the hallway, I would have to stand up and step into the hallway with them. So that's sight. You have to be within sight of them at all times. Missionaries have daily exercise as part of their schedule. And even if missionaries are going and running around a track, they're not allowed to just go do laps, at the pace that they feel the most comfortable. They can't be outside of sound of each other. And that's, you're not even supposed to be like within yelling sound. It's like talking sound. So you are glued to this person 24/7 until you receive your next assignment. So you are never alone. And the biggest reason given for this is just surveillance. It's so that your companion doesn't break any of the missionary rules. I had some companions who I was really close with and I was friendly with, and we would talk about all sorts of things. You're spending all day with this person. But I did have some companions that I really didn't get along with. And that was always really challenging because if you're assigned to someone, the minimum amount of time you're going to be assigned to them is 6 weeks. So imagine being paired with someone you really kind of don't get along with, maybe you dislike, and you have to be within sight and sound of them, share a bedroom with them, 6 weeks minimum. So it's very psychologically challenging in that way. I think it's one reason missionaries have this hyper strict and strange culture, because they are always with other missionaries and it's a very echo chamber experience. Missionaries are not paid. They work 7 days a week. You have 1 day off called P Day. And this is your only day to do laundry, to do grocery shopping, to communicate with family. And so even your quote day off is the only day you really have that you're allowed to do anything outside of missionary service. And so it's not really a true day off in the sense that you aren't permitted to go grocery shopping or do anything for yourself on any of the other 6 days of the week. And so that short time of day, because P Day is really just a window within the Monday, is unfortunately dominated by mostly housekeeping and the types of tasks that most of us fit into the days or nights or, whenever. But because you're not permitted to do that any other time, usually the P Day is not even really a day off as much as it is just preparing for the week. I mean, that's why it's called P Day. It's preparation day. For your 6.5 days of service, though, you are not paid, like I said. You do, however, have to pay. So you are doing this service 6.5 days a week. And not only are you not getting paid, you are asked to pay to have this privilege of going on a mission, which to me is honestly wild because the church has an estimated $100 billion plus of worth. And so the idea that they are not only asking families to pay 10% of their income to tithing and fast offerings and all the other ways that the church asks people to pay money, but then they are also asking families to send their sons and daughters for 1.5 years or 2 years for an unpaid service, sales for the church, where they go knocking door to door, and to pay for it. So the math on that, when you also account for the clothing, because you have to have clothing as you're serving a mission, you have to follow the missionary clothing standards, is an estimated $15,000 for a 2-year mission and $11,000 for an 18-month mission. So that's, $15,000 for a young man. That's $15,000 of an expense. That's 2 years of an activity that most people won't honor on a resume unless you're working for a Mormon company. And that's 2 years also that you've put off a degree. And so it's an incredibly high time commitment. It's a financial commitment. And it is also culturally very much expected, especially for young men. As a missionary, a lot of your meals and housing is provided by the church. Typically, depending on the area, you'll get your own apartment or you're asked to stay with members. That's how I did it. My entire mission was I lived with members of the church who opened their homes to us. You don't have access to your own money necessarily, though. You are supposed to use something called a MSF card, Missionary Supply Fund card. This, for me, was about $110 for a month. And so you do get fed dinners, somewhat by members, but that's not a given. And so a lot of missionaries don't have a lot of money because they get a very limited MSF fund that goes directly towards groceries, and it's against the rules to use it on anything else. And so that $100 is just for food. You're not supposed to really go shopping for fun. Your time is dedicated to the Lord. So you get $100 a month. That's it. You pay $500 a month to the church for the upkeep, I guess, of whatever it is you're doing. And otherwise, 7 days a week, 6.5 days a week, you are dedicating sun up to sundown to your missionary service. To qualify to serve a mission, you have to be following all the Mormon rules, specifically chastity. So if you've slept with people, you will be barred from serving a mission. Word of wisdom, tithing. Essentially, if you can qualify for a temple recommend, you will be able and be permitted to serve a mission. But it does, I think, lead to some lying because young men are so heavily pressured to serve a mission that if they are breaking some of the rules, maybe they're smoking or vaping or doing any number of the many things that disqualify you from serving a mission, a lot of times they just lie to their bishop because culturally not serving a mission makes you such a pariah that it's not worth it. And a lot of young men will just lie so that they can serve a mission. I think a mission is in many ways a rite of passage. It's not something that you're going to be kicked out of the church for, but I personally know people who faced suicidal ideation after going home early from a mission, young men, or choosing not to serve at all because they felt like it was so bad for them to have not gone on a mission that they wanted to die. And so the pressure, specifically when I was a missionary, I don't know the culture now, but I from Reddit and from what I read online, there is still very much a strong pressure to serve a mission if you want to be a good and fully fellowshipped member of the church. Also, growing up, girls are told that you should marry a returned missionary and that if someone doesn't serve a mission, that disqualifies them. And so young men also know that if they want to marry a righteous girl within their faith, they have to serve a mission because these girls have heard all throughout time growing up that serving a mission is 100% a must-have for marriage. Right before you serve a mission, you do go through the temple to receive your temple endowment. I will include a picture here of the ritualistic clothing that you wear as part of the endowment. You also begin to wear garments. This typically happens just a week or so before you go on your mission, and I think it's very insidious that they wait till you are going on a mission to allow you to go through and receive your endowment because a lot of people find the endowment ceremony to be very scary, very shocking, to feel betrayed. That's how I felt. And to just, in many ways, feel like you don't know what your own religion was teaching until you go through the endowment because it's very secretive. And so once you go through and get your endowment, it's very hard to back out of serving a mission because you've posted on it online. Maybe your family has flown out to say goodbye to you. You've told everyone you know. You've often put off school. And so if you balk and freak out about the endowment and wearing garments and really don't, and you don't want to deal with it, you don't want to participate in it, you have a bad reaction, it's very difficult to back out at that point because the endowment is attached to serving a mission. And so a lot of people, I think, allow the momentum of a mission. This was definitely the case for me. The momentum of the mission is what keeps you from freaking out about the endowment because ultimately you just have to say, okay, if my parents are good with it and every Mormon leader I've ever met is good with it, I guess that I will just learn and accept it as time goes on. And so you just put your head in the sand and allow it to happen to you, essentially. Serving a mission is typically when most young men start wearing garments. They're endowed. Same for young women. Another stepping stone would be marriage. And so if you didn't serve a mission, you would also get the endowment when you were married, or you can also initiate it on your own separately, but that's much more rare. Usually it's either paired with marriage or a mission. Before missionaries serve in the field, that's what it's referred to when you get your mission call, you're called to a specific geographic region. Before you go, though, to the region, that you are going to serve for your long-term 1.5 to 2 year mission, you go to something called the MTC, which is the Missionary Training Center. This is my MTC badge you see, and then a few pictures of me at the Missionary Training Center. I've put sticky notes over other people just for privacy's sake. But that's the key card I used to get around within the MTC because it's a very closed circuit. You have to use a key card to get in every single door. They really have it on lockdown. To get through the gate, you have to show your key card. There's people standing at the front. And so even if you get past the initial gate, at each door, you're kind of presented with, you can't get through unless you have this card with you. And so the entire MTC is very closed off from the rest of the world. They do not want anyone in there unless you are meant to be there. You're an employee there to teach the missionaries, or you're a missionary yourself. The length of time you spend at the MTC is based off of where you're going to serve your mission and what language you'll be speaking. So the primary purpose of the MTC is first to prepare missionaries to learn the rules, to know the lessons, and to know what you're going to be teaching, and to learn a language. So when I went, I served an English-speaking mission in Denver, Colorado. So I didn't learn a language. I was only in the MTC, I want to say, for maybe 11 or 12 days. But my husband, he served in Sweden, and I believe he was in the MTC for 8 weeks, maybe 12 weeks. And essentially, they'd tie the amount of time within the MTC to the level of difficulty of the language of where you'll be serving. So I believe Spanish is maybe 6 weeks, whereas something like Finnish or Japanese is going to be 12 weeks, maybe even longer. The Provo MTC is the primary MTC. There's an MTC in Mexico. There's several MTCs over the world, but most missionaries go to the Provo MTC where they teach 50 different languages. And typically the people who are teaching the languages are return missionaries who go to BYU and then teach the new fresh missionaries who are going to go out to these different places. And so if you've served your mission in a place like Korea, you can then go into the MTC, qualify to teach there, and then you can be a language teacher or a gospel teacher in Korean to the missionaries who are now being called themselves to Korea. There is culturally, I think, unsurprisingly, within the church, it's considered more cool to serve a foreign mission. I have one sibling who went to the Philippines and another sibling who went to Spain. Me and my third sibling went stateside. It's referred to going stateside. And it's always less exciting to go, within the United States purely because that's where you're from. I do 100% believe that racial profiling happens when they choose to assign you to a mission. And so they know if you're going to serve, say, in Ghana, that the people of Ghana, the people who live there, are going to be more receptive to somebody who looks like them. And so typically Black people will be sent to places where there are a lot of Black people because they know it's going to open the hearts of the people there to see someone who looks like them. And then typically within a companionship, because a lot of Mormons are ultimately white, they'll have one white companion and one companion of color that matches the place where those people are serving, so that they kind of have, honestly, I view it as like an in with the community because they look like them. And so I always found it gross, honestly, the level to which people who are Mormon and of color get racially profiled and sent to countries that match their racial profile, purely because it's a play to get into the heads of the people who are living there. And so I've heard stories of, say someone going to Korea where the white companion is the one that knows Korean because they've been there for a long time, and the American Korean doesn't know any Korean because they're from America, but their heritage is from Korea. And so as they pair those two people together, the Korean, and I've talked to ex-Mormon missionaries who feel this way, so this is a real thing, the Korean will get in the door with people, and then the Mormon missionary who is white, who's probably been there longer, but would be less trusted, is the one who then does more of the teaching. And so the church really utilizes the people of color who happen to be Mormon because there are not as many people of color in the church as white people to open doors that they otherwise would not be able to open if it was just white missionaries. Next, I'm going to talk about my experience serving a mission, but I will say that one of the most common questions I get, especially online, is, does it work? Does serving a mission actually work? And I think it depends on your metrics for work. And it depends on where you go. So the stereotypes, at least, are that if you serve in a place like South America, which is more religiously inclined, you'll have more baptisms, more converts, more people willing to listen to your message because they're predisposed to Christianity. Whereas like my husband serving in Sweden, which is a more irreligious place, most of his converts were refugees from other countries who had come to live in Sweden, who he met while he was out there. And so it really depends on where you serve if it works. Knocking on doors doesn't work in my experience and anecdotally from talking to a lot of other missionaries. But the reason a lot of missionaries knock on doors and spend a lot of time walking around is because you are supposed to be productive 24/7. And so if you have no one who is actively willing to listen to the gospel at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, the way for you to be productive is to go to a neighborhood and knock on doors and try to find someone who will be willing to listen to you. That being said, the main areas of conversion come from something called PMF and LA. Those are the acronyms used by Mormon missionaries. PMF is part member family. And so this would be a family where maybe the mom goes to church, but the husband doesn't. And so the missionaries try really hard to get the husband to take the missionary discussions and listen to the gospel and get baptized. And because with part member families, you already have an in, those are a much higher success rate because people are already familiar with Mormonism, they already have family who are Mormon, and so they're just more willing to listen to you, are more interested in potentially joining the church because their family is already in. The other is less active families. So this means they've already been baptized, but they've stopped attending church. And often with less active families, they have kids who are maybe teenagers, 9 years old, 10 years old. And essentially, if a less active family has a 9-year-old, if the 9-year-old gets baptized, that's considered a convert baptism. So you get to count it amongst your number of convert baptisms. And so those are kind of the two categories where missionaries try to spend a lot of time because people are more willing to listen to the message. They're familiar with Mormonism. It's not so difficult to kind of get your foot in the door, whereas knocking on doors, people already don't want to talk to people at the door, but then also typically have very little familiarity with the gospel, or they just don't want to be religious, or, any number of reasons why you wouldn't talk to religious people knocking on your door. Before I move on to my experience as a missionary, just a reminder to please like and subscribe to learn more about Mormonism, to learn more about my story, and to make sure that this video gets served to by the algorithm to whoever may want to learn more about Mormon missionaries. I served my mission in the Denver, Colorado mission, the Denver North mission specifically. One of the biggest questions I'm asked as a ex-Mormon is if I regret my mission, which the answer is yes, I do. It was a tremendous amount of time spent trying to convert people to a false religion. And I think a common response to that is, well, I bet you learned a lot or you grew a lot. And honestly, my response to that is I'm sure that there are many other ways I could have grown and learned to become a better person and be more responsible and follow a schedule and have responsibilities and care for people other than trying to convert them to Mormonism. And so I do regret my mission. I wish I would have spent that entire year and a half doing many other things with my life. But I served a mission. So let's talk about what it was like for me to be a Mormon missionary for a year and a half in the Denver North mission. A quick qualifier, some of the rules have changed since I served a mission, and every missionary's experience is different. And so what I say during this section is purely my own experience, my own feelings. I'm sure there will be Mormons in the comments saying that's not true or that's not how it is. And at least for this portion, this is my story, and this is what it was like for me. And they have changed some of the rules. Specifically, the biggest one is when I served my mission, I was not permitted to ever talk to my family other than Christmas and Mother's Day. And so for my year and a half, I spoke on the phone to my family 3 times. I was allowed to email them, but as far as speaking to them on the phone via video call, I almost never got to talk to them. And so that was very difficult for me to be separated from my family in that way. They have changed the rule, though. Now they allow video calls once a week with missionaries' families, which I think is very positive. If if young people are going to be pressured to go and serve missions, at least let them talk to their families. So I think that change was very needed, and I wish I had been lucky enough to be the benefactor of that rule change, but I was not. I was not permitted to serve a mission initially because I had mental health concerns that I had brought up to my bishop. He asked and said that I had to get cleared by a psychologist before. I've struggled with depression my whole life. And so I was not permitted to serve a mission. Initially, I had to meet with a counselor for about 9 months before she signed the paperwork that I was ready to go. When I was waiting, though, it was very difficult because I really wanted to go, and I was in the temple, and I received a very powerful revelation while I was doing baptisms for the dead that I would serve my mission in the Italian mission, or I would go to Italy, essentially. And I cried so hard, and I came home and I wrote in my journal that I know that I will serve a mission in... And I wrote that I know I will serve a mission in Italy as sure as I am that God lives. And so when I got called to Denver, Colorado, it was very shocking to me because I had a very spiritual feeling, the burning of the bosom, as Mormons call it, that I would serve my mission in Italy, and I didn't. And so that, I think, was another kind of chink in the armor of why did I receive what I thought was a very clear answer from God that was, that was impossible to weasel my way out of logically. Some people have said, maybe if you, this is, active members speaking, maybe if you had waited, you would have served your mission as a senior missionary in Italy. And I was not willing to give 50 more years to the church to wait and find out if I would go to Italy. And so perhaps that is true because there always is some reason that you should second guess your personal experience if your personal experience is telling you Mormonism is not correct. However, I felt very strongly that for my young person mission at age 20, I would go to Italy, and that was patently false. So that was kind of the kickoff. I was pretty disappointed to go to Denver because I wanted to serve a foreign mission. I wanted to learn a foreign language, at least for my husband who served in Sweden. He came out of his experience knowing Swedish and having lived in a foreign country for 2 years. And so I didn't really have any of that to have as kind of a positive silver lining to my mission. I went to Denver, Colorado. When I got to the MTC, there were a lot of nervous feelings, not just from me, but from the people around me. And I think I was surprised by the level of scrutiny and almost disbelief that was placed on me as an individual. People essentially, because of this whole surveillance situation, they act like you want to break the rules and that you are going to break the rules and that you have to be reminded of the rules constantly. And I had already spent a couple of years going to college and living by myself and buying my own food and paying my rent. And it was very strange to almost be thrust back into this childlike state of not being trusted when I had been living on my own and taking care of myself and being responsible for a very long time prior to serving my mission. And so I think entering this culture of we aren't going to take you at your word that you're going to follow the rules. We're going to assume you won't. And that's why you need a companion. And that's why you need this book of rules. I have a little missionary handbook today that I'll read in a bit. That was very difficult for me. And I felt very distrusted as a person, which was shocking because I wanted to serve a mission. I was there of my own free will and choice, but they definitely acted like we assume you'll break the rules, and that's why we have to be so on top of you all the time about the rules versus assuming good intent and assuming trust as a default. And so the first few days of the MTC, I started to hear this mantra that I would hear throughout my mission, which is that obedience brings blessing and exact obedience brings miracles. And that was the mantra of my entire mission, which is that this thick book of rules, along with mission specific rules, along with this handbook, would be the drum to which I should march for the entire year and a half. And that if I was not obedient, I would not experience miracles, and that in effect would be keeping the gospel from people. And to be clear, I'm not talking about breaking rules like I'm trying to go have a drink at a bar. I'm talking about the type of obedience that if the missionary schedule says wake up at 6:30 and you wake up at 6:31, that is disobedient. That is a sin. And that will keep you from having the Lord trust you to bring the types of people who are ready to listen to the gospel into your lives. So I definitely feel like missions are a hotbed for people with OCD or people with any sort of or anyone who struggles with anyone who struggles with very black and white thinking, because the level to which you are told to be obedient is so strict and so many rules to be obedient to that it creates a lot, I think, of mental health problems for the people who are trying to follow these rules so religiously and to feel so horrible for sleeping in till 6:01 or to spending an hour and 10 minutes on lunch instead of the hour, or even, feeling guilty for hearing typical music in a Target because you're not supposed to listen to worldly music. You're only supposed to listen to the music from the church that you've been approved to listen to. And so there's a lot of tiny little rules that get planted in your brain, and that it's very difficult to kind of work your way mentally through the idea that as a human being, you need to be able to breathe and live and take a break and express yourself. But there's this strict rule book that is saying, here's how every second of your day and life should be governed or should be governed. When I first got on my mission, I had a trainer. And so this was a girl who had been in the mission maybe for 6 months before me. This is how everybody, goes through this training program. You learn the ropes. They tell you how to talk to people, how to approach people, what to say if you are knocking on doors, how to specifically, how to invite people to be baptized. That's a big deal. Reciting the first vision and memorizing it is a big deal, so that when you're teaching a lesson, you can say, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head above the brightness of the sun. And all of these things you're being trained to do, so that when you're teaching an investigator, you aren't just, saying whatever comes to your mind. You are following very strictly the missionary lessons, and even your questions are scripted, your responses are scripted. And so my first few months were definitely dedicated towards being trained. I continued to feel this sense of almost like lack of trust, and having people treat me like I was a teenager again, and have all of these rules that people were assuming almost I wouldn't be following unless they were watching me like a hawk. And I almost had to just remind myself constantly, I am an adult. I've lived by myself for years at this point, and I'm not just some child that needs to be treated like they are gonna put their hand in the cookie jar all the time. I had a fairly good relationship with my trainer. She taught me to be very focused on numbers, because numbers are people and people are converts to the church. And so as a missionary, you spend a lot of time tracking numbers. You track how many people you talk to a day. You track potential investigators, if they might be interested in the gospel, if you can go back to talk to them. You track the number of lessons you have, the whole day. You have a daily planner that I believe now is virtual on a phone. But I had a paper planner. And so the entire day is very scripted. The entire day is highly orchestrated, and you report these numbers to a district leader or to a zone leader. So this is always a man. Those are only men can do those positions. So you're not only tracking these things, but you are reporting your numbers, and your numbers are being compared against other people's numbers. And missionaries with great numbers are shouted out at meetings and, receive little certificates and a lot of praise, whereas missionaries with lower numbers don't get that type of attention. And so it's very competitive. It's very almost a little dehumanizing, I think, at some points, because you're so focused on the numbers that it feels like a gut punch if you're not putting up the numbers that you feel like you're supposed to be. Specifically, I had a lot of stress around inviting people to be baptized, because you're supposed to invite people to be baptized in the first lesson, the first official time you meet with someone, which is kind of crazy and a little silly, because it's just very soon to say, hey, do you want to join a church that requires 10% of your income, and you don't know anything about it yet, specifically about, things like the endowment, or, committing to not drinking coffee or alcohol ever again. And you'll have to get married to your person you're living with before this, but do you want to be baptized? And so it was always stressful, especially at the beginning, before I kind of got over the mental block of inviting people to be baptized. By the end, I was more comfortable with it, and I would just, everybody we'd talk to, do you want to be baptized? But at the beginning, that was a hard bridge for me to get over, because I felt like it was kind of hard to commit people to be baptized when they didn't even know what they were committing to. But that is definitely a very, very central part of serving a mission, is to invite people to be baptized. So here at the end of the first lesson is the invitation to be baptized. So I'll read it to you. You're supposed to say, you're supposed to use a will you question when when you're asking people to do things. So if I was inviting you to be baptized right now, I would say, will you follow the example of Jesus Christ by being baptized by someone holding the priesthood authority of God? We will be holding a baptismal service date on 3 weeks from now. We will be holding a baptismal service 3 weeks from now. Will you prepare yourself to be baptized on that date? And so I would ask people that will you question pretty much all the time, if they would at least put up with talking to me. It was really hard on me to have a companion. I think that was psychologically definitely the most, that and the kind of mundane but grueling never-ending schedule were the two most difficult aspects of serving a mission. So I really struggled with staying with another person all the time, sight and sound. You kind of feel like you are just truly, you really are just never alone. And so you never get to mentally, have some time to just decompress by yourself. You are always with that person. And there is something called companionship inventory, which is so funny, that you're supposed to do once a week, which is basically where you compliment there's a whole outline for it where you're supposed to compliment each other, and then you're supposed to say what the other person needs to improve on, which really creates a lot of toxic conversations, I think, because people really get on each other's nerves when they're with each other 24/7. And so during companionship inventory, it might be something about, I don't like how you keep our room clean. I don't like how, you do X, Y, and Z when we're out tracting and we're knocking on doors, or, sometimes, like I said, if I had a good companion I had a good relationship with, it would just be positive. But sometimes it would be very difficult to have these companionship inventory meetings, because you're just kind of wishing that the experience with them would just be over, and that you wouldn't have to try to solve the glaring problems between the two of you. In the front of my Preach My Gospel, I do have a list of the people who I helped get baptized into the church. There's probably about 20, 25 names here. Some of these people I was more involved with, and met them for the first time and led them all the way through getting baptized. And then sometimes if you're transferred to a new area, you kind of pick up where the last missionaries left off. And so some of these baptisms were people who were getting taught as they were who were getting taught. And then as I was transferred in, I would finish teaching them, or they would get baptized after I left. And so I still counted them. And so I have, you can kind of see from here my long list of names. And then I also listed my companions, my areas. And so this was kind of a record of my entire mission. It is very discouraging to serve a mission because, I actually had a fairly, quote, successful mission from a perspective of baptisms. But, even 20 people over the course of a year and a half is still... that's not a lot to fill a calendar with when you are working 6.5 days a week. And so I did have a hard time, I think, with the discouragement of almost wasting my time knocking on doors, walking around. I had one area that was basically 3 miles by 3 miles. So, by the time I left that area, I had literally knocked on every single door in that entire 3 by 3 mile area, because we just had so little to do. And so it's very discouraging to feel kind of like you're wasting your time, and then you feel guilty for wasting your time because you're supposed to be teaching people. But if no one will listen to you, you're kind of just left with the option of just knocking on more doors, calling more numbers of people who don't call you back. And it's a very discouraging experience in many ways. And a lot of missionaries talk about this concept of converting yourself, and that, if you're going to have one convert, it should be at least convert yourself. And so that's kind of this almost catch-all that people use to make themselves feel better when they're feeling discouraged, because they just say, okay, well, even if I don't convert anyone on my mission, at least I converted myself, which is, I think a very true aspect of having young people serve missions is getting them hyper involved with and focused on Mormonism, because you've dedicated so much of your time and energy to it. And so it is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that when you go on a mission, you end up converting yourself a little bit. At least to some extent. And that is how I felt as I left my mission, was I had converted myself more fully to God and Jesus Christ and the restoration through Joseph Smith. I did live with members all of my mission. These were typically people who kind of had their arms twisted to have the missionaries live with them. Honestly, it's not super easy to have 2 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds living with you at your house, and it's a huge sacrifice. And some people do it for free. Some people do have the church pay them rent, like a small amount of rent. So, a lot of people, I think, view it as almost, at least I always felt like on my mission, I feel like a lot of people had a grudge about housing the missionaries. But they still chose to do it purely because they felt like it was their responsibility. And in the temple, you covenant to give everything you have to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so when people come knocking and say, hey, will you let 2 people live in your house, maybe for free? A lot of people say yes to that, but they're not always super happy about it. And so I'd have people who would say, your showers can't be too long. You need to clean the kitchen in this way when you're finished. You need to have, this level of noise, or you need to, you can't exercise outside. You have to exercise in the garage. And so it was a very, you already have all these rules within a mission, but then you're also asked to respect the sometimes very strict rules of the family that you're staying with, who are kind of saying, you can stay here conditional upon all these other things that I'm going to ask you to do. And my worst experience with this, 2 worst experiences. The first was my parents were kind of getting a divorce while I was on my mission, and I had a lot of sadness about that, as which is not surprising. And I stayed with a couple in one of my wards who would argue a lot at night, and we would hear them just yelling at each other. And I confided in my mission president that I was having a hard time where we were currently living because at night we would hear a lot of arguing. And I said this hoping that he would move us out of that house and to another house, and that would be that, and it would be okay. But he went, my mission president, to their bishop and confronted their bishop, or told their bishop, hey, the missionaries are saying that these two people are fighting a lot, and you need to call them into your office to fix the situation. And so one day we got home and this couple sat us down and very angrily said, you told your mission president we have a bad relationship. You're making us look bad in front of your bishop, of our bishop. And how could you do this? This was so unfair. And they were really angry. And I honestly, that was one of the worst moments of my mission, because I had really trusted that my mission president would look out for me and help me find a better place to live that was in a better situation. And instead he made it so much worse. And that couple was so much meaner to us after that. And the fighting didn't stop either. So I essentially just had to kind of put up with that as my reality until I was moved out of the area, maybe a month or two later. The other example was towards the end of my mission. I lived with a woman who was definitely a hoarder. She had us in a room in her basement, and to get to that room, you had to squeeze through lined shelving full of very old cans of food and rice and stuff that if you picked it up, it was covered in dust, and the expiration date would have been from the 80s and 90s. And we were in a room in the basement in the very back. So you have to walk through all of this food and stuff to get through. And she was elderly. And I think in hindsight, my biggest frustration and just almost disgust is knowing that everyone knew that they were having the sister missionaries live with hoarders, and no one did anything about it. Everyone in that ward, the elderly, the mission couple, the older mission couples, they have to sign off on the apartment. So someone that was, in their 50s, 60s, went to that woman's house that was a hoarder. They saw that food. They walked down through the tunnel of food into the tiny room in the back of the basement, and they said, we check this off that this is to the standard of the church. And then I lived there for 6 months. And so that to me was really hard. And when I first got transferred and I had my new companion, she said, just so you know, I'm going to give you a heads up. We live in a house that's pretty hard to live in. And I remember saying, like, should we say anything? And she said, well, I've lived here for 4 months and I haven't said anything, because you are very heavily discouraged from sharing negative things or complaining. You're viewed as being kind of problematic, or that you're not willing to sacrifice for the church or for the Lord. And so just like she said, I also didn't say anything. And I didn't say anything, but also in hindsight, I know other people knew, and they also just said it, shrug about it. So I think that is honestly, though, like, not that bad of a story compared to what other people have experienced on Mormon missions, specifically in other foreign countries where living situations are much, much worse than that. And so I'll say that sucked for me, and it would suck for most people, but that's not even as bad as what a lot of people go through in as far as living situations go as missionaries. And it is despicable that the Mormon church has $100 billion and they're making their missionaries who are working for free pay to serve missions to live in hoarders' homes. That's crazy. So, might still have a chip on my shoulder about that, but it's in the past now, I guess. I was a very honestly productive missionary. I have a lot of little certificates that I got saying I was the highest finder or the highest baptizer. And within maybe 4 months, five or probably between 4 and 6 months, I got called to be a sister training leader, which is the highest level of leadership a girl can have in a mission. And so and when you're a sister training leader, you get to train another missionary and you go to special leadership conferences. So I was a great missionary on paper. And I think I very much tied my self-worth to my ability to pull great numbers and work myself ragged. And I had tons of people from my wards, say really positive and great things about me. I definitely worked myself to the bone because I felt like that was the only way to honor God. And so working and living the missionary lifestyle for a year and a half was very mentally taxing because it's the same day every single day, but working very hard and you never get to see your family. But I will say, I got to be a sister training leader, and it's leadership within missions it's very strange. It's very sought after because it's viewed as righteousness. To be an assistant to the president, that's the highest a man can be within the mission. A young man can become an AP, assistant to the president, and only 2 men fill that position. So in a mission of maybe 150 men, only 2 of them are going to be called to that leadership position. And those guys can marry whoever they want because it's basically like, the most attractive or like sought after type of man is, to be able to say I married an AP, which is very silly. And a lot of those guys, they're just people, but they're all just people, but leadership is its own little hyper fixated culty dream for missionaries because it is objective certification that you're good at being a missionary, and it's definitely bragging rights for whoever at the mission or even at home. Being able to write home and tell your mom you have a leadership position is very exciting. So leadership, all this infighting and vying for leadership is very strange, and it I think also contributes to the hyper fixation of obedience and numbers culture because you want to be able to say you got the little star badge on your shirt. I will say my most positive experiences were from members who were super, super kind. Every ward seems to have at least 1 or 2 families that invite the missionaries over often for dinner, who help them send packages, who go and meet with them to go see investigators. And so I did in every ward have different people who were really kind. I think of one woman in particular who she would bake food for us all the time. She would give us hugs. She was just so warm and so friendly. And she would view, I think a lot of these, specifically women, kind of view themselves as the moms to the missionaries because the missionaries have no moms because they can't talk to their moms. At least they couldn't. And even now, like, your mom is far away. So I always really appreciated the people who were willing to kind of step up to the plate like that. When I got home, it was definitely mentally very challenging too. You would go from this message that you're doing God's work and that what you're doing is so important and so worthwhile to then you're home and you don't have this strict schedule and maybe you're just back at school, or maybe you're waiting for school to start and you're at home, or you have a job making, whatever minimum wage. And it's just, I think a lot of people honestly end up feeling like they fall off a cliff when they leave their mission because you go from this hyper fixated culture around your day-to-day schedule and the belief that what you're doing is God's work on earth and that you're consecrated to him and that it's very holy, to then you're just at home eating Cheez-Its, waiting for school to start. And so a lot of missionaries, I think, and I remember I went to watch a movie in a movie theater, and I literally just started crying during the movie because I felt like my life was so worthless and so not worthwhile anymore, and that I used to call people to come into Christ, and now I'm just watching a movie like a commoner. And so I definitely, especially in the first few months, I think a lot of missionaries are pretty weird when they get home because they're so used to this almost make-believe world of missionary work that when you go back to the real world, it's really hard to cope with just a normal day-to-day schedule of an average person. And I definitely felt like that. Next, I'm going to talk about the rules Mormon missionaries have to follow. Before I do, just a reminder to like the video and subscribe, comment, read through the comments. If you served a mission yourself, feel free. I would love to have some comments of what it was like for other people to serve missions in the comments. There's some great Reddit threads that are great, but also horrible about specifically the almost abuse levels of horrible things that people experienced in foreign missions. So drop in the comment if you served a mission, what it was like for you, just to add more voices. Because I think as much as my mission was hard, I think I actually probably basically kind of got off easy, because it was only hard because I was hard on myself. I didn't serve in a place like, I have a friend who served in Russia who was in a place where she literally got lead poisoning from the water, and she had to come home early and had a ton of surgeries and still has health complications because of this lead poisoning she got. So, I mean, compared to that, I was walking on clouds. So like the video, comment if you served a mission, what it was like for you, and let's talk about the rules. So this is called the White Handbook. They do have an updated version of the rules, but the rules are still fairly similar. I cross-referenced the rules I'm going to be talking about today with the current handbook, and they're the same, just written in different form. There is a very strict dress code for Mormon missionaries, and I'll include here what that looks like for women. It's not even skirts to the knees. It's supposed to go past the knees. Very much, it's definitely supposed to cover the religious garment, so higher collarbone. You're not even supposed to have capped sleeves, like a full sleeve for men. They have the white shirts. They changed the rules to include some blue shirts, and now you can have no tie. But it's worth noting that even though they changed these rules, often there's a good, better, best of, I could wear a blue shirt, but I think everyone around me is wearing white, so I'm going to wear a white shirt. So, I think they've gone a bit lax on some of the dress standards, but it's still very modest, very conservative. And my guess is that if you went and surveyed 100 missionaries from your local area, they would still be wearing on the much more conservative side of exactly how a Mormon missionary is supposed to look and dress. To me, one of the most strict aspects of the missionary handbook is the daily schedule, which you are supposed to follow to the T. So I mentioned earlier the 6:30 versus 6:31 rule. So all of this is meant to be followed with the most specific, strict level possible. At least that's how it was for me. And exact obedience, like I said, is very heavily emphasized. And so I'll include here the current missionary schedule. It includes waking up at 6:30, praying, exercising, showering. You're supposed to do 60 minutes of personal study and planning. Then you go out from 10 to 9 p.m. From 10 to 9 p.m., you're supposed to go out and teach and serve others. They explain a few things that you should be adding to that throughout the day. So companion study, learning a new language, eat lunch and dinner. They specify no more than 2 hours combined. That's how it was on my mission. So 1 hour for lunch, 1 hour for dinner. That is a kind of an update. So I guess if you had 30-minute lunch, you could permit yourself to have an hour and a half for dinner. And then you return home at 9. So essentially from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m., you are out teaching. From 6:30 a.m. to 10 a.m., you're either exercising, getting ready, or studying your scriptures. And so a typical day would be you wake up at 6:30, you have exercise for 30 minutes. That brings you to 7. You shower, eat breakfast. That probably brings you to 7:30 or 8. That brings you to 8. And then from 8 to 10, that's 2 hours for personal study and planning. Maybe there's a little wiggle room in there. So let's say you have your 2 hours in the morning to plan, reading the scriptures. So that's working. You're doing missionary work. You're reading the scriptures. You're discussing what you're going to do for your day. And then from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m., you are finding, teaching, and serving others. So let's say 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 11 hours. We'll subtract 2 for eating, so that's 10 hours. So that's a 12-hour day, essentially, that you are supposed to be on as far as reading the scriptures, talking to people, doing something missionary oriented with your day. So that's a 12-hour work day. And that goes Tuesday through Sunday. So that's essentially 12 hours a day times 6. That means you're working 72 hours a week dedicated. That is dedicated time to missionary work. That's not exercising, eating meals. So you have a 72-hour work week essentially as a Mormon missionary. And then your Monday, like I said, is your preparation day. That's the day that you can do laundry and go grocery shopping. And it also has this little asterisk. It says your daily activities should focus on interacting with people. Spread your planning and study activities throughout the day to avoid spending long periods of time in your apartment. So be out and proselytizing as much as possible. The schedule approved for your mission will allow time to work, rest, and refocus. I would say arguably that a 12-hour day does not give sufficient time for rest. It gives a list of suggested activities to do on your preparation day. So this says communicating with your family, doing laundry, getting haircuts, cleaning, shopping, resting, and participating in approved recreational activities. So this includes, there's a little section, historical and cultural sites, museum and galleries, zoos and parks. So we would essentially, after finishing this list of laundry, haircuts, cleaning, shopping, communicating and emailing, all of those things, then you have, if you still have time, which usually, honestly, I would say maybe once a month on a P day, we would get stuff done ahead of time and we would have time to do something, quote, for fun, for recreation. But it certainly wasn't a priority, and it was always the first thing to go, for sure, because all of these other responsibilities are supposed to be attended to first. Another rule is that missionaries should only refer to each other by their surnames. That's why you have your little missionary tag. So most of the missionaries in my mission, I only knew them by elder so-and-so or sister so-and-so. Once you're with your companion, maybe after you've known them for a bit, you might share your first name with them, but it was discouraged to ever refer to anyone by their first name. I think this is definitely one form of mission mind control where you are no longer really yourself. My whole life I went by Alyssa. For my whole mission, I was not Alyssa. And for people to call me Alyssa was disobedient. And so that's one way to kind of strip your identity from you, is not allowing people to refer to you by your given name, but by your surname only. As I said, when I went, I couldn't call your family. Now they have the rule you can call your family. They had limited time that you are allowed to be on the computer. So I could go email, but we had a 60-minute time set, and that was my time for emailing. So it's considered disobedient if you're spending too much time on your preparation day communicating with family. When I was on my mission, had a fairly strict time set, and once that time was off, that was it. That was you were done communicating with your family. And it is kind of funny. I'm sure this is still the case. The most missionaries go to public libraries, at least in the United States, to do emailing, because that's where there's free and public computers. So if you go on a Monday to a public library, you might end up seeing some missionaries, because that's where they're approved to go to have internet access that doesn't require the church to have computers that they've bought out of their own bank account, So typically we would go to the public library if we wanted to have time to email our families. Dating is a big no-no in missions, and this is, I think, a really common question I get asked in the comments of a video. If I make a TikTok video about missionaries, there's always comments asking, or I get DMs asking if they are allowed to date a missionary. And missionaries are not permitted to date anyone within their mission area, so no one that they would see in person. A lot of missionaries have people they are dating from afar who are from their home. I think one reason that a lot of people want to date Mormon missionaries is because, honestly, Mormon missionaries are very attentive and good listeners, and they're available and they'll text. And if you're a non-member, they're very willing to sit with you, talk with you. They're supposed to ask about, what are you going through in your life? Can we pray for you? And they're honestly just usually, I think, well-dressed, authentic, kind of lending a listening ear. And this happens a lot, I think, with younger people, where they meet the missionaries and they feel like they have this connection with missionaries. And I've very much met people who are trying to get with missionaries on my mission, growing up in the church. It's kind of its own little romantic fantasy, I think, that a lot of people have, which is to just, have a missionary fall in love with them. And it does happen, I would say I've heard many stories of people marrying missionaries who served within their area, and the missionary in most stories will serve their whole mission and then return once they're released from their calling to date this person that they might have met. So it does happen. And a lot of times, if a missionary has a female or male convert, that they're interested in, they will go back for them and they'll marry that person. And it's not atypical. It's also not atypical for missionaries to marry other missionaries. And so on your mission, when in my mission specifically, a lot of the missionaries I served with all got married to each other. And it actually, I'll include here, it was so funny. I had a lot of missionaries from my mission get married to each other, and so much so that they had a quote from my mission president in an article about this phenomenon of so many missionaries marrying other missionaries. Did not marry a missionary from my mission, so my mission president didn't come. There was like a comment made essentially that my mission president was only attending the weddings of 2 missionaries from his mission marrying each other, because there were so many people getting married that he didn't have time to go to all the weddings. But if it was 2 missionaries from the same mission getting married, he would go, and that was a little hurtful for obvious reasons. So if you want to date a missionary, if that's even why you're watching this video, it's not impossible, but you might just have to wait till they are back from their mission to reach out to them and see if you can get any magic going with them. You're not permitted to watch or listen to or consume any media not approved by the church. So this means you can't read novels, you can't listen to pop music, you can't, consume really anything, any media outside of, a church approved stuff, your scriptures, your church handbooks. The music was a huge conversation on my mission, because the most righteous missionaries would say they're only listening to hymns. Some people would listen to something called EFY music, which is church produced for youth, and it's kind of a little more poppy, a little bit more energetic. I listened a lot to a band called The Lower Lights, which was kind of indie versions of Mormon hymns. So everybody found their own way of listening to music, but it's very limited. It's mostly just hymns that you're allowed to listen to, or some music produced by the church. Other random rules: no swimming, no no full court basketball. A lot of the rules that missionaries have are to reduce the liability the church has. So they don't want missionaries drowning. They don't want missionaries getting hurt, because they don't want to have to pay the medical bills of missionaries. And so seeking medical care on a mission is very strange, and it's honestly taboo. It was on my mission, and I've heard the same from other missionaries. You're discouraged from seeking medical care before you can, say, go to an urgent care. If you have a pressing issue, you have to get approval from the mission president's wife. And it's kind of often, the times I was sick and felt like I had a need, it was very much that you have to go through your parents' insurance. The church isn't going to cover it. And you were just, stay at home and have some cough drops and, drink some herbal tea, try to heal at home. I have a friend who got into a bad bike accident and had his skin pierced through and needed stitches, but he didn't seek medical attention. He didn't go and try to get help for quite a long time. He's kind of bleeding out. for a few hours, just sitting there waiting for the mission president's wife to respond. And so the whole medical care situation is very difficult for missionaries because it's kind of viewed as you putting, it's almost viewed as you asking the church to provide for you, or like sucking the resources of the church. That's a very common theme within Mormonism, is like, don't ask the church to provide for you. Don't suck the resources away from the church, which, as I've mentioned, the church has billions of dollars. So it's very frustrating. Like, for example, in many wards, the members are asked to clean the church building instead of them hiring professional cleaners. And people get frustrated even about that because, why am I giving 10% of my income and giving so much of my time and energy and resources to the church and being asked to clean the church building when it's been made very well known that the church has $100 billion. So anyways, back to the mission. I think that any time that you are kind of being needy, asking for medical care, asking for support, it's viewed as kind of sinful a little, or just looked down upon, because you should be able to just like grit your teeth and bear it so that you're not draining the church's resources. There's also a high commitment, I think, to staying on your mission despite issues that you might be having personally or issues that you're having at home. There was an elder on my mission whose mom passed away, I believe, of cancer, and he did not go to the funeral. He didn't attend his own mother's funeral because he didn't want to have the church pay for his plane tickets. And he also said that my dad would want me to stay anyways. My dad would be disappointed. And so this young man, I still think about that guy. Like, I cannot believe that he missed his own mother's funeral. And that's not uncommon. If there's a death in the family, it's often the case that it's viewed as more righteous and better for missionaries to stay in the field over, going home for a 48-hour wedding, or a 48-hour funeral even is viewed as not something you should ask. And maybe that's changed now. I hope it has. I hope that they're allowing 18-year-old boys to go see their mother get buried, because that's so horrible that you would pass up this kind of moment in your life so that you could go knock on people's doors and bother them to listen about Joseph Smith. But I don't know. So if that's changed, I hope it has. Please say in the comments, because it will make me feel better. There's also a practice of taking people's passports in foreign countries that is pretty pervasive. Essentially, when you arrive in the mission field in a foreign country, they keep the passports at the mission office, which makes it so that you really are kind of stranded. If you chose to go home, you actually can't go home unless you go through the proper channels and say you want to go home, get your passport, that kind of a thing. So you're kind of, in many ways, as a missionary, a captive in your own mind, and sometimes a captive of, your mission president. Because, as a missionary, that I felt probably, in hindsight, like I wish I would have said, I'm not really feeling this. This is really difficult. It's not very productive. There's a lot of problematic things about what I feel like I'm doing. But I never left. And I have a lot of people ask, why do you keep wearing garments? Or why did you keep going on this way if you were feeling like that? And I think in many ways it's because you believe it. You just fully believe that God wants you to wear magic underwear. You just fully believe that the temple endowment is God's way of speaking to you. And if you don't like it, that's you problem, and if you don't like your mission, then that's because you're not righteous. It's not because the mission is bad or wrong. And so I think being in a high demand religion, what some people would refer to as a cult, it's very difficult mentally to extricate yourself from the mental load of your responsibility to God, because, it's not like you are doing it just because people are watching you and you don't want to be judged. You're doing it because you fundamentally believe that God wants you to be doing what you're doing. So it's very difficult, if your mom passes away and you want to go to her funeral, if you really believe God will judge you for that, or God will judge you for seeking medical care, and that you're weighing down your mission and your reward. You're not going to, not because you're going to get in trouble for it, but because you fundamentally believe that that's what God wants you to be doing. As part of being a missionary, the primary lessons, there's 3 main lessons that are doctrinally focused. So the first is the first time you ever meet with somebody and truly sit down with them, you talk about Joseph Smith and the restoration of the gospel. So that's the first lesson. The second is about the plan of salvation. So that's about where we came from, why we're on earth, and where we go after we die, and about God's plan for our souls in the afterlife and over the long term. And then I always found it was so funny that the third lesson is the gospel of Jesus Christ, because you're talking about it, everybody's always talking about the atonement and how Jesus is really important, but it is the third lesson. So it does seem to be the third most important, but I think that's because they really want you to get on board with Joseph Smith before they start talking about Jesus. Because most people, at least in the United States, most Christians, they're not gonna fight you about Jesus, but they probably will disagree about some of the assumptions and claims made about Joseph Smith's restoration of the gospel. So those are the primary doctrinal lessons. After you teach those 3, you go on to teaching about the different commandments that you have to follow as a member of the church. So this is everything from the word of wisdom, no coffee, to studying the scriptures, obedience, praying often, keeping the Sabbath day holy, the law of chastity. You go over the 10 commandments. So you kind of go through all the rules, tithing, obeying and honoring the law, fasting. So that's a lot of small rules that you're teaching. And then the last lesson number 5, are the laws and ordinances of, and you teach this before baptism, like right before they get baptized. So you teach about the priesthood and the different levels of the priesthood, and you teach about eternal marriage, and temples. So you do, you kind of touch on temples, but you're obviously not going to be talking about the endowment. It's more of the philosophy behind the temple, which is, when you're married in the temple, you're married for time and all eternity, not death do you part. And we do family history so that we can be sealed and tied to our predecessors. And so those are the 5 lessons. So once you teach those 5 lessons, and once the person, at least in my mission, I believe this is pretty standard, has to attend church 3 times, they are permitted to get baptized. So if you met the missionaries, on a Saturday and they taught you the first lesson, then you go to church the next 3 Sundays, the church says you are allowed to be baptized. And you do have to have a little interview before you get baptized where you promise to follow all the rules and stuff like that. Another common question I get in the comments often is, what do I say or how do I respond to Mormon missionaries when they approach me? That's a very understandable question. I would say, be kind, be gracious. Be kind, be gracious. They have a lot of people who aren't willing to talk to them. Like I said, they may be they're working, maybe about 70 hours a week trying to get people to talk to them. You certainly don't have to engage with them at all. I do have a lot of people also message me that they've met with the missionaries. This is a funny but also common DM, is they've met with the missionaries and then they've come across information about stuff that they didn't know about Mormonism, like Joseph Smith's polygamy, or inaccuracies of the Book of Mormon, or the temple endowment, or garments, or the church's $100 billion, whatever unfavorable information that made them decide that they actually don't want to join the church. So they ask, how do I disengage? And typically missionaries are somewhat persistent, but if you are firm with them, they're not going to hound you, hopefully. So if you've been meeting with missionaries and you choose to not continue to meet with them, just being firm and saying, I've thought a lot about it and I've decided that I don't want to continue learning about your church. I appreciate you spending the time to teach me. And I just want to let you know that I will not be receiving any more lessons, and thank you. And you might have to just not answer the door, because I did have some occasions where I would go obnoxiously and still try to convince people to listen to us, especially if I felt like they had been very interested. Just don't answer the door. It's disappointing for them, but don't, like the more you kind of make it seem like you might be interested eventually, they're going to keep coming back. So just be firm. Don't, missionaries are taught to not Bible bash with people. Don't try to, deconvert them. That's not, honestly, in my experience, very helpful when people are like, well, did you know this about your religion? Because you're honestly already so trapped in the prison of your own mind as a missionary that you're not really in a place where you are probably going to be receptive to information, negative information about the church. You're also not permitted to read anything not approved by the church. And so even if someone tries to kind of tip you off or say, hey, have you thought about this with your religion? You don't have permission to have internet access. So you're not going to go home and stay up late looking at your phone, reading the CES letter. So I would, you do you, but I would say it's probably not very productive to try to discourage people from being a missionary. Bible bashing is probably not going to be effective. I think if I was you, I would ultimately probably be polite, but, give them some water bottles and send them on their merry way. I've touched a bit on foreign missions, and I wanted to just before I've touched a bit on foreign missions. So just to kind of be a little bit more specific about what it's like to be on a foreign mission in a foreign country versus the United States. Often foreign missions, in my experience, seem a little bit more lax because there's fewer people around saying there's a right way to do and be Mormon. And so there's maybe less hyper focus on the leadership roles I talked about, or kind of the hyper fixation of following rules. Typically, a lot of people wonder how missionaries learn languages so fast, and it really starts in the MTC. It's a total immersion, and the obedience aspect really helps because you are heavily discouraged from speaking in English or your native tongue. You are supposed to speak with your companion in your learned language, with your teachers in your learned language. And so basically from day one, you just have to be listening to, whatever language it is you're trying to learn and really figuring out what people are talking about. And then once you get there, you're spending the whole day ideally talking with either your companion, who is going to speak with you in the tongue of the country that you're serving, or with people from the country who are going to be speaking to you in their native tongue. And so it's just the immersion aspect is typically why people become so good at these languages. Is it's full immersion. You're not talking with your family. You are talking with your companion in the learned language. And so it's just very, you're not even allowed to go on the internet and read, like, let me go scroll my phone for a bit and read in English. Everything you're going to be reading is going to be basically in the language you're learning, except for maybe your own personal set of scriptures. So that's just a lot of exposure to this language you're attempting to learn and master. I think one of the most common things I see with people who serve foreign mission is having pretty significant health issues. Issues arise from experiences they had on their mission. I had a friend who served in Ghana who spent a few months with just an actual parasite in his gut and lost 30, 40 pounds, and he was already very skinny. I mentioned my friend with the lead. A lot of women often face pretty significant harassment. Walking around out and about knocking on doors as a woman is not necessarily that safe. And so there's a lot of catcalling or people following them. And so there's kind of, I think in a foreign country, depending on the country, it's definitely more dangerous, either because of other people or because the housing, the food is not necessarily going to be the safest. And so people either face danger from other people or health issues from being exposed to dangerous, unhealthy situations. I also think in foreign countries, it's very common to, I also think foreign missions are very problematic and very difficult because often, especially in very poor countries, missionaries are asking people to pay tithing when they have very little money. So my sister, like I said, served in the Philippines, and she's most of her areas where she was serving were people who didn't have running water, people who didn't have electricity, and she's asking them to give tithing. And, you know, as a believer, whether it's Mormonism or in many different forms of beliefs, there's a tithe aspect. But when you're asking someone who has very little money to pay tithing, and you're telling them it's going to give you blessings and this is what God wants, that's ethically pretty questionable to me. So in a lot of these foreign countries, there's a lot of poverty that I've known my friends to have experienced when they go to serve their missions, and asking people to attend church and buy church clothing that's appropriate, and pay tithing and get a ride to church, or take off work on Sunday so that you can attend church. Those are all things that's a pretty big burden to be asking people who are already experiencing high levels of poverty. So the ethics behind the church growing in these poverty-stricken countries is, to me, very questionable. And obviously, ultimately, if the missionaries meet people who are willing to talk to them and who are willing to pay tithing, that's their choice. It's to me still ultimately quite unethical. A reminder to like this video, subscribe, send it to a friend who wants to learn more about Mormonism or served a mission themselves. I've touched a little bit on what it's like to be a return missionary, but just to flesh out, what it was like for me and what it's like for a lot of people, you're really heavily encouraged to get married as quickly as possible. So a lot of people truly hit the ground running as soon as they're back from their mission. They are looking for a spouse. And because you're so programmed already to be following rules and following expectations, I think a lot of people do get married because they just are following the next step on this long Mormon path. And so a lot of people get married. A lot of people begin looking for spouses. The marriages typically happen very quickly. I got engaged and married within a year and a half maybe of being home from my mission, and I knew my husband, who I'm still with, for less than a year total on our wedding. So we knew each other maybe for 10 months, and we were engaged for about 3 or 4. So very fast. And when you're embroiled in that culture, it feels very normal to just get married, to get engaged, to marry the first person you date seriously after you're back from your mission. But it definitely creates, a lot of divorces too. I've personally had friends who have gotten divorced from the people who they married very quickly right after their mission. I think too, as a return missionary, a lot of people struggle with OCD tendencies, or just the kind of psychological difficulty of going from a hyper rules-based existence that is very kind of holy. Like I've mentioned, when I was back, I did end up teaching at the MTC, which was very interesting, kind of like coming full circle. I taught English-speaking missionaries for about 11 days, the English-speaking amount of time people are on their mission. It's very interesting to be on the teaching side of things because I saw a lot of missionaries really struggle with adapting to this new, cutting off from your phone, cutting off from your family. I had lots of missionaries who would end up going home, and honestly sometimes was a very domino effect. I had a few groups of missionaries where one missionary would go home and then another one would go home, and I had one specific group, and typically the groups are maybe 10 missionaries, where 4 different missionaries in an 11-day period chose to return home. And so being a teacher and seeing that other side, and seeing when I was on my mission, when I went to the MTC, nobody went home from my specific group of people. But, you'll also I had some missionaries come out and then they'd get very guilty and would confess to having had sex before their mission and then be sent home in utter and total shame for them and for their family too. So I saw a lot of this kind of culture of kids coming out on missions, newly endowed, fresh set of garments, cut off from families, hyper demands, put on them, who really kind of just freaked out and had a very difficult time and ended up needing to go home. Thank you for watching my explain all, tell all about missionaries. I will make sure to drop links of anything I mentioned in the comments. Please don't forget to subscribe. Send this to friends or family, somebody who's curious about missionaries, somebody who served a mission themselves. And I'm dropping a video every week, so stay tuned for next week's topic, which I still have to decide.